All right, today we are diving into a truly transformative period in India's history, the Indian Renaissance. This was a time of huge debate, radical ideas, and massive social change. So let's just jump right in.
Just think about that question for a second. How do you rebirth an entire society? It's a massive, almost impossible-sounding task, right? But that was the exact challenge that reformers in 19th century India were facing. They weren't just tinkering around the edges. They wanted to spark a complete and total rebirth of their culture.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start by really defining what this rebirth was all about. Then we'll look at what kick-started it, meet the key people who drove the change, see how they tackled really deep issues like faith and caste, explore the tools they used to do it, and then, finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the legacy that's still with us today.
Okay, first up, what do we actually mean when we say the Indian Renaissance? Let's break down what this great rebirth really was.
So the word itself literally means rebirth. But this wasn't about hitting rewind and just going back to some golden age of the past. No, this was a powerful awakening of the mind and of society. It was about a huge shift towards progressive, liberal, and, this is the key word, rational thought, which they then used to challenge traditions that had stood unquestioned for centuries.
To really get a handle on the scale of this challenge, our source material gives us this brilliant analogy. Picture Indian society as a garden, a once beautiful garden that had been left untended for a long, long time. It was dormant, overgrown with the weeds of, outdated traditions, oppressive customs, and all sorts of social evils. The garden wasn't dead, but it was crying out for someone to come and tend to it.
So what lit the match? What was the spark that got this whole revolution in thinking started? Let's talk about the catalysts.
What you're seeing here is basically a clash of two very different worlds. On one side, you had India's deeply rooted traditions, the rigid social structures, the blind faith, some really oppressive practices. And on the other side, you had the British introducing Western education. Now, they probably didn't intend for this to happen, but it exposed a new generation of Indian thinkers to these radical Western ideas, things like democracy, logic, reason, and individual rights. And that collision, well, that's where the sparks began to fly.
And that brings us to the people who actually rolled up their sleeves and got to work. If society was the garden, then these were the gardeners, the architects who didn't just dream of a new India, but actually started to build it.
And you really have to start with this man, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He's often called the father of the Indian Renaissance. He was a brilliant scholar, and his most famous campaign was his all-out crusade against sati, the absolutely horrific practice where a widow would be forced to burn herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
Now, I want you to remember this year, 1829. This is a huge turning point, the moment a moral fight became the law of the land.
Because in 1829, after years of relentless campaigning by Roy and his allies, the British government passed the Sati Regulation Act. This was massive. It made the practice illegal and punishable by law. It was concrete proof that determined, focused reform could actually change society.
But, ending sati was a huge victory, but the fight was far from over. It didn't solve the terrible plight of widows, who were often just cast aside and forced to live these incredibly difficult lives. This is where the next great reformer, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, stepped in. He championed their right to remarry and to have a life of dignity.
And that leads us to another landmark date that you need to know, 1856. This was the year the next major legislative domino fell. Yep, in 1856, Vidyasagar's tireless work paid off. The Hindu Widows' Remarriage Act was passed. This gave widows the legal right to marry again. And let me tell you, there was fierce, intense opposition from the Orthodox community, but it got done. It was another giant leap forward.
Now, these reformers were smart. They knew that just changing laws wasn't going to be enough. You had to go deeper. You had to tackle the belief systems themselves, the very things that were propping up these traditions. And that meant taking on the monumental challenges of religious orthodoxy and the rigid caste system.
So, for instance, Raja Ram Mohan Roy didn't just stop at fighting sati. A year before that act was passed, he founded the Brahmo Samaj. The whole point was to reform Hinduism from the inside, to build a more rational faith that promoted belief in one God and pushed back against idol worship and what he saw as just empty rituals.
And then you had the caste system. This is where another key reformer, Jyotira Phule, comes in. And his vision, well, it was nothing short of revolutionary. This quote says it all. He imagined a society where no one would be considered subordinate because of their birth. He was fighting for a society built on total equality.
So the big question is, how did they pull all this off? What were the actual tools these gardeners used to bring about this rebirth? Well, it really came down to two of the most powerful tools imaginable: education and literature.
Education was seen as the key to everything, the ultimate tool for liberation. And you can see the momentum building here. It starts with movements like the Brahma Samaj promoting modern thought, and it continues with figures like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, who founded what would become Aligarh Muslim University, specifically to bring modern scientific education to India's Muslim community.
And right alongside education was the incredible power of the pen. Literature became a driving force for change. I mean, you have giants like Rabindranath Tagore, whose writings did so much more than just tell stories. They helped to build a whole new, proud, modern Indian identity, one that celebrated its own culture while eagerly looking to the future.
So, when you put this all together, what's the legacy? What was the lasting impact of this incredible period? Well, let's wrap up by looking at that garden, which was finally, after so much work, beginning to bloom.
This table just lays it out so perfectly, doesn't it? You have Raja Ram Mohan Roy laying the foundation, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar fighting for widows, Jyotirao Phule with his radical vision of an equal society, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan championing modern education, and Rabindranath Tagore shaping a new cultural soul through literature. Each one played an absolutely crucial part.
And this brings us right back, full circle, to our garden analogy. This is so important. The reformers weren't trying to tear out the garden and plant a new one. No. They were tending to it. Just like this quote says, they used the tools of reason and education to pull out the weeds so that the original plants, India's own incredible culture, could finally bloom again, but with a new, modern vitality.
And that really just leaves us with one last thing to think about. The greatest legacy of these reformers was their sheer courage. The courage to look at the world they lived in and ask, is this the best we can do? To question the traditions everyone else took for granted. So the question for us today is a simple one. What traditions in our own time are waiting for us to question them?